Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. My name is Mel, I'm joined by Matt and Simone, and the story we're going to look at this week is Princess Rosette by Madame d'Aulnoy. I hope I've said her name properly, she's French. So I picked this story. It is a fairy tale. The characters are royals and they go on an epic quest to find the King of Peacocks because Princess Rosette will only marry the King of Peacocks. She doesn't want anybody else. That's the only person she wants. What I like about this story is that the heroine is in the driver's seat. She knows what she wants, and I mean, she's kind of lazy in that she lets her brothers go off and get it for her, but I mean, delegation is sometimes the way to go. So here it is. Here is Princess Rosette by Madame d'Aulnoy. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen who had two beautiful boys. They grew like the day, so well did they thrive on the excellent food provided for them. Queen never gave birth to a child without sending for the fairies and begging them to tell her what would happen to the infant. Her next was a beautiful little girl, so handsome that you could not look on her and not love her. The queen, having sumptuously entertained the fairies who had come to see her, said to them, when they were preparing to depart, "Do not forget your good custom, but tell me what will happen to Rosette," the name they had given to the little princess. The fairies replied that they had left their conjuring books at home, and that they would come and tell her another time. "Ah," said the queen, "that bodes me no good. You do not wish to afflict me by predicting some misfortune, but I entreat you to let me know all. Hide nothing from me." They made every sort of excuse, and only increased the queen's desire for more information. At last the principal fairy said to her, "We fear, madam, that Rosette will be the cause of some great misfortune to her brothers, that some affairs of hers will cost them their lives. That is all that we can foresee respecting this beautiful little girl, and we are very sorry we cannot tell you anything more agreeable." They departed, and the queen remained so melancholy that the king could not avoid seeing it in her face. He asked her what was the matter. She answered that she had been sitting too near the fire, and had burnt all the wool off her spindle. "Is that all?" said the king. He went up into the loft and brought her more wool than she could spin in 100 years. The queen continued in low spirits, and the king asked her what was the matter. She told him that, walking by the riverside, she had lost one of her green satin slippers. "Is that all?" said the king. He sent an order to all the shoemakers in the kingdom, and they furnished Her Majesty with 10,000 green satin slippers. She still continued sad. The king again asked what ailed her. She told him that in eating too hastily she had swallowed her wedding ring, which had slipped off her finger. The king knew she told him a falsehood, for he had the ring safe in his own possession. "My dear wife," said he to her, "you are not speaking the truth. Here is your ring, which I put for safety into my purse." The queen was much confused at being caught telling a falsehood, for lying is the most disgraceful thing in the world, and she saw that the king was angry. She therefore told him what the fairies had predicted about little Rosette, and requested him to say if he could think of any remedy for the evil. The king was so much distressed that he said at once to the queen, "I do not see any other way to save our two sons than by putting to death the little girl while she is still in her swaddling clothes." But the queen exclaimed that she would sooner suffer death herself, that she never would consent to so cruel a deed, and that the king must think of something else. The minds of their majesties being naturally occupied with this matter entirely, someone informed the queen that in a great forest near the city there was an old hermit who lived in a hollow tree, and who was consulted by people from all parts of the world. "I must seek him also," said the queen. "The fairies have told me the danger, but have forgotten the remedy." She rose very early, and mounted a beautiful little white mule shod with gold, two of her maids of honour accompanying her, each on a handsome horse. When they were near the wood, the queen and her ladies dismounted out of respect for the hermit, and went on foot to the tree he lived in. He objected to the sight of females. When he saw it was the queen, he said to her, "You are welcome. What is your will with me?" She told him what the fairies had said about Rosette, and requested his advice. He told her she should put the princess into a tower, out of which she should never be permitted to step. The queen thanked him, made him a good present, and returned with her information to the king. When the king heard this account, he ordered a great tower to be built as quickly as possible. He put his daughter into it, and that she might not feel dull, the king, the queen, and her two brothers went to see her every day. The eldest was called the Great Prince, and the younger the Little Prince. They were passionately fond of their sister, for she was the most beautiful and amiable creature ever seen, and the least of her glances was worth more than 100 pistoles. When she was 15, the great prince said to the king, "Papa, my sister is old enough to be married. Shall we not shortly go to her wedding?" The little prince said as much to the queen, and the majesties answered them evasively, saying no word about the marriage. At length, the king and queen were taken very ill, and died almost on the same day. Everybody was very sorry. There was a general mourning, and the bells tolled throughout the city. Rosette was inconsolable for the loss of her good mother. After the funerals of the king and queen, the dukes and marquises of the kingdom seated the great prince on a throne of gold and diamonds, with a magnificent crown on his head, and robes of violet velvet embroidered all over with suns and moons. The whole court then shouted 3 times, "Long live the king!" and nothing was thought of but rejoicings. The king and his brother said to each other, "Now that we are in power, we will take our sister out of the prison in which she has passed so many weary years." They had but to cross the garden to reach the tower, which had been built in a corner of it, as high as possible, for the late king and queen intended the princess should remain in it all her life. Rosette was embroidering a beautiful robe on a frame before her, but when she saw her brothers, she rose and took the king's hand, saying to him, "Good morning, sire. You are now king, and I your little servant. I beseech you to take me out of this tower, where I am very dull." And with that she began to weep. The king embraced her and told her not to cry, that he had come to take her out of the tower and conduct her to a fine chateau. The prince had his pockets full of sweetmeats, which he gave to Rosette, saying to her, "Come, let us quit this foul dungeon. The king will soon find a husband for you. Don't afflict yourself any longer." When Rosette saw the beautiful garden, all full of flowers, fruits, and fountains, she was so astonished that she could not utter a word, for she had never seen anything of the sort before. She gazed eagerly about her, now walking, now stopping, now gathering fruit from the trees or flowers from their beds. Her little dog, named Fairytale, who was as green as a parrot, had but one ear, and danced to perfection, ran before her, bow-wow-wowing with 1,000 jumps and capers. Fairytale amused the company amazingly. All of a sudden he ran into a little wood. The princess followed him, and never was one so astonished as she was at seeing in this wood a great peacock with his tail spread, and looking so beautiful, so beautiful, so beautiful that she could not take her eyes off him. The king and the prince rejoined her, and inquired what she was amusing herself with. She pointed the peacock out to them, and asked them what it was. They told her it was a bird that was occasionally eaten. "What?" she exclaimed. "Do they dare to kill such a beautiful bird and eat it? I declare to you that I will never marry anyone but the king of the peacocks, and when I am queen, I will take good care that none shall be eaten." Nobody can describe the astonishment of the king. "But, sister," said he, "where would you that we should find the king of peacocks?" "Wherever you please, sire, but I will marry nobody else." After she had made this resolution, the 2 brothers conducted her to their chateau, whither they were obliged to bring the peacock also, and place it in her apartment, for she was exceedingly fond of it. All the ladies who had never seen Rosette hastened to salute her and pay their court to her. Some brought her preserves, others sugar, others dresses of gold stuffs, beautiful ribbons, dolls, embroidered shoes, pearls, and diamonds. She was entertained everywhere, and she was so well bred, so polite, kissing hands and curtsying when any pretty thing was given to her, that not a gentleman or lady left her dissatisfied with their reception. While she was thus keeping the best company, the king and the prince determined to find the king of peacocks, if there was one in the world. They decided that a portrait of the Princess Rosette should be taken, and they had one so finely painted that it did all but speak. They then said to her, "Since you will not marry anyone but the king of peacocks, we are about to set out together in search of him throughout the world. If we find him, we shall be very happy. Take care of the kingdom till we return." Rosette thanked them for the trouble they were taking. She said she would carefully govern the kingdom, and that during their absence all her pleasure would consist in contemplating the beautiful peacock and making Fairytale dance. They could not refrain from tears in bidding each other farewell. Behold these 2 princes on their journey, inquiring of everybody, "Do you know the king of peacocks?" Everybody answered, "No, no." They travelled on still further, and at last went so far that nobody has ever been such a distance. They arrived at the kingdom of mayflies. Never before were seen so many. They made such a buzzing that the king was afraid he should never hear distinctly again. He asked one, who seemed the most sensible amongst them, if he knew whereabouts he could find the king of peacocks. "Sire," said the mayfly to him, "his kingdom is 30,000 leagues from this place. You have taken the longest road to it." "And how do you know that?" said the king. "Because," replied the mayfly, We know you very well, and go every year to pass 2 or 3 months in your gardens." The king and his brother embraced the mayfly. They became great friends and dined together. They saw all the sights of the kingdom, admiring its curiosities, the smallest leaf on any tree in it being worth a pistole, after which they set out again to finish their journey, and as they had learned the way, they were not long about it. They saw all the trees laden with peacocks, and every part of the kingdom so full of them that you could hear them scream and talk at a distance of 2 leagues. The king said to his brother, "If the king of peacocks is a peacock himself, how does our sister mean to marry him? We should be mad to consent. A pretty alliance she would inflict on us, some little peacocks for nephews." The prince was no less troubled about it. "It is a most unfortunate whim," said he, "that she has taken into her head. What could have induced her to imagine there was a king of peacocks in the world?" When they arrived at the principal city, they perceived it was full of men and women, but that they were dressed in clothes made of peacocks' feathers, and wore a profusion of them everywhere as very fine ornaments. They met the king, who was driving out in a fine little coach of gold and diamonds, drawn by 12 peacocks, fully caparisoned. This king of the peacocks was so handsome, that the king and the prince were charmed with him. He had long curly light hair, an exceedingly fair complexion, and wore a crown of feathers from the tail of a peacock. When he saw the 2 brothers, he judged that, as their dresses were of a different fashion to those worn by the people of the country, they must be foreigners, and to ascertain the fact, he stopped his coach and ordered them to be called before him. The king and the prince approached him, having made their obeisance, said to him, "Sire, we have come from a great distance to show you a beautiful portrait." They took out of their portmanteau the grand portrait of Rosette. When the king of the peacocks had examined it attentively, "I cannot believe," said he, "that there is such a beautiful maid in the world." "She is 100 times more beautiful," said the king, her brother. "Oh, you are jesting," replied the king of the peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "there is my brother, who is a king as well as you. He is styled the king, and I am called the prince. Our sister, of whom this is the portrait, is the Princess Rosette. We come to ask if you will espouse her. She is beautiful and very virtuous, and we will give her a bushel of golden crowns." "Yes, truly," said the king. "I will marry her with all my heart. She shall lack for nothing at my court. I will love her excessively, but I declare to you that I expect she is as handsome as her portrait, and that if it flatter her in the slightest degree, I will put you to death." "Well, we consent," said the 2 brothers of Rosette. "You consent," rejoined the king. "Then to prison with you, and there remain until the princess shall arrive." The princes made not the slightest difficulty, for they were perfectly certain that Rosette was handsomer than her picture. When they were in prison, the king of the peacocks had them admirably attended to, and frequently went to see them, keeping in his own castle the portrait of Rosette, on which he so doted that he slept neither night nor day. As the other king and his brother were in prison, they wrote immediately, and to come with all speed, as the king of the peacocks was waiting for her. They did not tell her they were prisoners, for fear of alarming her. When she received the letter, she was so transported with joy that she thought she would die of it. She told everybody that the king of the peacocks was found, and desired to marry her. They kindled bonfires, fired guns, and made feasts of sweetmeats and sugar throughout the kingdom. Everyone who came to see the princess during 3 days had given to them a slice of bread and butter with jam on it, some wafers, and a glass of hypocras wine. After she had been thus liberal, she left her beautiful dolls to her best friends, and her brother's kingdom in the hands of the wisest old men in the city. She strongly enjoined them to take great care of everything, to spend very little, and save up money against the king's return. She begged them to preserve her peacock, and would take nobody with her but her nurse, her foster sister, and her little dear green dog Fretillon. They put to sea in a boat, taking with them the bushel of gold crowns, and clothes enough to change their dress twice a day for 10 years. They did nothing but laugh and sing. The nurse asked the boatman, "Are we nearing the kingdom of peacocks?" He answered, "No, no." Another time she asked him, "Are we nearing? Are we nearing?" He answered, "We shall be soon, we shall be soon." The third time she said to him, "Are we nearing? Are we nearing?" He answered, "Yes, yes." And as soon as he had said so, she went to the end of the boat, seated herself beside him, and said to him, "If thou choosest, thou shalt be rich for ever." He answered, "I should like it much." "If thou choosest," she continued, "thou shalt gain some good pistoles." "I desire nothing better," replied he. "Well," said the nurse, "thou must help me then tonight, when the princess is asleep, to throw her into the sea. As soon as she is drowned, I will dress my daughter in the princess's fine clothes, and we will conduct her to the king of the peacocks, who will be happy to marry her, and for thy reward we will load thee with diamonds." The boatman was very much surprised at the nurse's proposition. He said it was a pity to drown so handsome a princess, that she excited his compassion, but the nurse produced a bottle of wine and made him drink so much that he could no longer refuse her anything. As soon as it was dark, the princess lay down as she was wont. Little Fairytale was snugly established at the bottom of the bed, moving neither foot nor paw. Rosette was sleeping soundly when the wicked nurse, who was wide awake, went to fetch the boatman. She led him into the princess's cabin. Then, without disturbing her, they took her up, with her feather-bed, mattress, sheets, and counterpane, foster sister helping them with all her might, and flung the whole of it into the sea, and the princess was so fast asleep that she never woke. But, by good fortune, the feather-bed was stuffed with phoenix feathers, which are very rare, and possess the property of never sinking in the water, so that she floated on her bed just as if she had been in a boat. The water, however, gradually wetted first the feather-bed and then the mattress, and Rosette, being incommoded by it, turned from side to side and roused Fairytale. He had an excellent nose, and smelt the soles and the codfish so close to him that he began to bark, and barked so much that he woke all the rest of the fish. They began to swim around, the great fish running their heads against the bed of the princess, which, having nothing to steady it, spun round and round like a whirligig. She was very much surprised. "Has our boat taken to dance on the water?" said she. "I have never been so uncomfortable as tonight." And still Fairytale kept barking and making a desperate pother. The wicked nurse and the boatman heard him a long way off, and said, "There is that little rogue of a dog drinking with his mistress to our good health. Let us make haste to land." For they were just in sight of the city of the King of the Peacocks. His Majesty had sent down to the beach 100 coaches drawn by all sorts of rare animals. There were lions, bears, stags, wolves, horses, oxen, asses, eagles, peacocks, and the coach intended to convey the Princess Rosette was drawn by 6 blue monkeys who could jump and dance the tightrope and play all manner of amusing tricks. They had a beautiful harness of crimson velvet plated with gold. There were also 60 young ladies whom the king had selected to entertain the princess. They were dressed in all sorts of colours. Gold and silver were the meanest ornaments about them. The nurse had taken great pains to deck out her daughter. She had covered her with Rosette's diamonds from head to foot, and dressed her in her friend's robes. But despite her finery, she looked more ugly than an ape, with greasy black hair, squinting eyes, crooked legs, a great hump in the middle of her back, an ill-tempered slut, continually grumbling. When all the servants of the King of the Peacocks saw her come out of the boat, they were so surprised that they could not speak. "What does this mean?" said she. "Are you asleep? Come, come, bring me something to eat. You are a nice set of rascals. I will have you all hanged." At this threat they said to each other, "What a vile creature! She is as wicked as she is ugly. Here's a fine wife for our king. I am not surprised at it. It was not worth while to send for her from the other end of the world." All this while she played the mistress, giving slaps on the face and blows with her fist, for next to nothing, to everybody about her. As her train was very numerous, she proceeded slowly. She sat in her coach like a queen, but all the peacocks had perched themselves in the trees to salute her as she passed, and had resolved to cry, "Long live the beautiful Queen Rosette," when they perceived her to be such a horrible fright, cried, "Fie, fie, how ugly she is!" She was excessively enraged and mortified, and said to her guards, "Kill me those rogues of peacocks who are insulting me." The peacocks flew away quickly, and made game of her. The rogue of a boatman, who witnessed all this, said in a whisper to the nurse, "Gossip, all is not well with us. Your daughter should have been handsomer." She replied, "Hold thy tongue, fool. Thou wilt bring some misfortune upon us." They sent to inform the king that the princess was approaching. "Well," said he, "have her brothers told me the truth? Is she more beautiful than her picture?" "Sire," they replied, "it is quite sufficient for her to be as handsome." "Yes, surely," said the king, "I shall be perfectly satisfied with that. Let us go and see her." For he knew by the great noise they were making in the court that she had arrived, and he could not distinguish anything they were saying except, "Fie, fie, how ugly she is." He thought they must be speaking of some dwarf or animal she might have brought with her, for it never could have entered his head that it actually applied to herself. The portrait of the princess was carried at the end of a long staff, uncovered, and the king walked in solemn procession after it, with all his barons and all his peacocks, followed by the ambassadors from the neighbouring kingdoms. The King of the Peacocks was exceedingly impatient to see his dear Rosette. Mercy! When he did see her, he was nearly dying on the spot. He flew into the greatest passion in the world. He rent his clothes, He would not go near her. She frightened him. "How?" he cried. "The two scoundrels I hold in prison are bold indeed to have made sport of me, and to have proposed to me to marry a baboon like that. They shall die. Go, lock up instantly that impertinent girl, her nurse, and the fellow who brought them hither. Fling them into the lowest dungeon of my great tower." On the other hand, the king and his brother, who were prisoners, and who knew the day on which their sister ought to arrive, had put on their best clothes to receive her. Instead of opening their prison and setting them at liberty as they had hoped, the jailer came with more soldiers and made them descend into a cell, perfectly dark and full of horrid reptiles, where they were up to their necks in water. Nobody was ever more astonished or more miserable. "Alas," they cried to each other, "this is a sad wedding for us. What can have brought so great a misfortune upon us?" They knew not what in the world to think, except that they were doomed to die, and they were completely overwhelmed with sorrow. 3 days passed without their hearing a word. At the end of the 3 days, the king of the Peacocks came and insulted them through a hole in the wall. "You have assumed the titles of king and prince," cried he to them, "in order to impose upon me and engage me to marry your sister, but you are nothing better than vagabonds who are not worth the water you drink. I will find judges for you, who will quickly try and sentence you. The rope is already twisting, which shall hang you both." "King of the Peacocks," replied the king in great wrath, "be less hasty in this matter, for you may have cause to repent. I am a king as surely as you are one. I have a fine kingdom, robes, crowns, and good money." "Ha ha! It's the fine joke truly for you to be talking of hanging us. Have we stolen anything from you, pray?" When the king heard him speak so boldly, he knew not what to think, and he was tempted, at times, to let them go with their sister and not put them to death. But his confidant, who was a downright courtier, encouraged him, saying that if he did not take vengeance on them, everybody would laugh at him and would think him a mean, petty sovereign not worth a groat. He swore that he would not forgive them, and ordered their trial to take place. It did not last long. It was only necessary to exhibit the portrait of the real Princess Rosette by the side of the person who had presented herself under that title. Consequently, they were condemned to lose their heads as false traitors who had promised to give the king a beautiful princess in marriage and had only offered to him an ugly country wench. Court went in full state to the prison to read the sentence to the prisoners, and they declared that they had not been guilty of falsehood, that their sister was a princess fairer than the day, that there was some mystery which they could not understand, and that they demanded 7 days' respite of the execution of their sentence, as in that time their innocence would probably be acknowledged. The king of the Peacocks, who was greatly incensed, was very loath to grant them this favour, but eventually he consented. Whilst all this is passing at court, we must say a word about the poor Princess Rosette. When day broke, she was greatly astonished, and Fairytale also, to find themselves in the middle of the sea without boat or assistance. She began to cry, and wept so bitterly that all the fishes pitied her. She knew not what to do, or what would become of her. "Assuredly," said she, "I have been thrown into the sea by order of the king of the Peacocks. He has repented his promise to marry me, and to get fairly rid of me has ordered me to be drowned. What an extraordinary man!" she continued. "I should have been so fond of him, we should have lived so happily together." Thereupon she wept more bitterly, for she could not help loving him. She remained thus for 2 days floating on the ocean, first one side and then the other, soaked to her bones, with a cold enough to kill her, and all but benumbed. If it had not been for little Fairytale, who imparted a little warmth to her heart, she would have died 100 times over. She was tremendously hungry. She saw the oysters in their shells. She took as many as she chose and ate them. Fairytale had little liking for them, but he was obliged to eat something. When it grew dark, Rosette became exceedingly frightened, and she said to her dog, "Fairytale, keep on barking, for fear the soul should eat us." He had barked all night, and the princess's bed was not far from the shore. On the coast there was a good old man who lived all alone in a little hut, which nobody ever came near. He was very poor, and cared nothing for worldly goods. When he heard Fairytale bark, he was quite surprised, for dogs seldom pass that way. He thought some travellers had lost their road, and charitably came out of his hut to direct them. All of a sudden he perceived the princess and Fairytale, who were floating on the water, and the princess, seeing him, stretched out her arms and cried to him, "Good old man, save me, for I am perishing here. I have languished thus for 2 days." When he heard her speak so sorrowfully, he had great compassion for her, and re-entered his dwelling to get a long boat-hook. He waded into the water up to his neck, and thought twice or thrice he should be drowned. At length he contrived to pull the bed to the shore. Rosette and Fairytale were vastly glad to be upon dry land. The princess thanked the good man warmly, and wrapping herself up in her counterpane, walked barefoot into the hut, where he made a small fire for her with dry leaves, and took out of his chest the best gown of his deceased wife, with stockings and shoes, which the princess put on. Thus, dressed like a peasant, she looked lovely as the day, and Frétillon danced round her to divert. The old man saw plainly that Rosette was some lady of rank, for the coverlid of her bed was gold and silver, and her mattress of satin. He requested her to tell him her history, and assured her that he would keep it a secret if she wished. She recounted the whole of it, weeping very much, for she was still under the belief that it was the King of the Peacocks who had ordered her to be drowned. "What shall we do, my daughter?" said the old man to her. "You are so great a princess, accustomed to dainties, and I have nothing to give you but black bread and radishes. You will fare badly with me, and if you will take my advice, you will let me go and tell the King of the Peacocks that you are here. I am sure that if he had seen you, he would have married you." "Ah," exclaimed Rosette, "he is a wicked creature, and will put me to death. Do you have a little basket? Let us tie it round my dog's neck, and it will be very unlucky if he does not bring back something to eat." The old man gave the princess a basket. She tied it around Frétillon's neck, and said to him, "Go to the best saucepan in the city, and bring me what may be in it." Frétillon ran to the city, and as there were no saucepans better than the king's, he entered the royal kitchen, took the lid off the largest, adroitly possessed himself of its contents, and returned to the hut. Rosette said to him, "Go back to the buttery, and bring me the best of everything." Frétillon returned to the buttery, and filled his basket with white bread, muscadel wine, and all sorts of fruits and preserves. He was so laden that he could hardly wag. When the King of the Peacocks called for his dinner, there was nothing in the saucepan or in the buttery. The servants all stared at each other, and the king was in a fearful rage. "Very well," said he, "there is no dinner for me, but take care that the spit is put down this evening, and that I have something very good roasted." When evening arrived, the princess said to Frétillon, "Go to the city, enter the best kitchen, and bring me some nice roast meat." Frétillon did as his mistress ordered him, and knowing no better kitchen than the king's, stole into it softly while the cooks' backs were turned, and took all the roast meat off the spit, so nicely done that the mere sight of it gave you an appetite. He brought his basket home, quite full, to the princess. She sent him back immediately to the buttery, and he returned with all the royal preserves and sweetmeats. The king, who had not dined, being very hungry, decided to sup early, but there was nothing to set before him. He put himself into an awful passion, and went to bed supperless. The next day at dinner and supper time it was exactly the same case, so that the king was without eating or drinking, because, when he was ready to sit down to table, it was discovered that everything had been carried off. His confidant, greatly disturbed, fearing the king would die, concealed himself in a little corner of the kitchen and kept his eyes constantly on the pot that was boiling. He was much surprised to see a little green dog with one ear enter very softly, take off the cover, and put all the meat into his basket. He followed it to see whither it went. He saw it go out of the city, and followed it to the good old man's. Immediately he returned to tell the king, and all his boiled and roast was taken day and night to the hovel of a poor peasant. The king was much astonished. He ordered the man to be brought before him. The confidant, to pay court to the king, determined to go himself with the archers of the guard. They found the old man dining with the princess upon the king's boiled meat. They seized and bound them with strong cords, and secured Frétillon also. As soon as they arrived at the palace, the king was informed of it, who replied, "Tomorrow will be the 7th and last day I granted to those impudent impostors. They shall die with these thieves who have stolen my dinner." So saying, he entered the hall of justice. The old man fell on his knees and said he would confess everything. While he was speaking, the king gazed on the beautiful princess and pitied her tears. When the good man declared that she was the Princess Rosette, who had been thrown into the sea, notwithstanding the king was so weak and faint for want of food, he jumped 3 times for joy, ran and embraced her, and untied the cords with which she was bound, assuring her that he loved her with all his heart. At the same time the princes were sent for, who, imagining that it was for their execution, approached very sadly, hanging down their heads. The nurse and her daughter were also brought out. When they looked at each other, a general recognition took place. Rosette threw herself on the necks of her brothers. The nurse, her daughter, and the boatman flung themselves on their knees and prayed for mercy. The joy was so great that the king and the princess forgave them. The good old man was richly rewarded, and lived all the rest of his days in the palace. The King of the Peacocks, in short, made every sort of amends to the king and his brother, proving his regret at having ill-treated them. The nurse restored to Rosette her rich clothes and her bushel of gold crowns, and the nuptial festivities lasted 15 days. Everybody was satisfied, down to Frétillon. who from that day never ate anything but the wings of partridges. Okay, so what did you both think of Princess Rosette?
I think she's a particularly spoilt child.
I mean, she was locked into a tower for most of her life.
I don't know how you can go from being locked in a tower for most of your life to suddenly thinking you're privileged to whatever you wish for.
I know. Compensation for being locked in a tower for most of your life.
Well, I suppose.
Particularly given your parents didn't bother telling you or your family why you were locked in the tower for all your life.
Yeah, that was pretty messed up.
Yeah.
I like that she knows what she wants.
But it's so ridiculous.
Felt like a whim. It's like she saw a peacock and was like, you know what? I want to marry the... I mean, she didn't even specify how she wanted to marry the human equivalent. She just said the king of peacocks. She could have been really into bestiality.
And she didn't even know if such a person existed, and neither did her brothers, which was funny to me.
It was just, I don't know, it felt like a very childish demand in a certain way. Like, not childish in the sense of, like, foolish, but childish as in something a child would say.
And then her brothers take it way too seriously. Maybe they're really guilty about having seen her locked in the tower for so long, and they're like, well, I guess we'll do what she wants.
Yeah.
I don't know. If I was one of the brothers, I'd be tempted to just go to like the nearest school and just ambush someone around the back of the bike sheds and just be like, "Hey kid, do you want to be the king of the peacocks?"
Yeah, but then they have to be part of the royal family.
Well, nobody knows who the king of the peacocks is. You could just pick someone and be like, "Well, you're the king of the peacocks now, mate. Have fun."
That's true. I like the premise, though, about a sister who's going to kill her brothers. Always a fun one.
Yeah, you spend the beginning going, oh, okay, she's probably going to turn out to be pretty evil then, and at the end it's just like, no, I want to marry the king of peacocks.
So how come the prophecy was just wrong?
Yeah.
Well, the fairy was just giving it off the cuff. She did say that she'd left her books at home or something like that. It was the queen who insisted she wanted a prophecy. The fairy was like, oh, well, all right, I'll give you a prophecy, but, she didn't have her books, so maybe she gave the wrong one.
Good point.
Or she was lying, or she just made it up. I don't know.
I mean, this whole thing could have been so easily avoided just because she wanted this one prophecy.
Yeah.
All this stuff happened.
And maybe stop trying to decide your children's lives ahead of time.
It makes me what she said about the other brothers that made the queen so trusting in her prophecy.
Your children will be beautiful and wonderful, which is what every parent wants to hear.
And the funny part is that you can say it to any parent and they'll believe it. And then they're like, wow, you can see the future.
Okay, so maybe the fairies were taking advantage of the queen.
Maybe.
I mean, she did give them lots of stuff right before they made their prophecy. Like, oh, it's that time of year. Queen's pregnant.
We see a lot of prophecies in fantasy, either probably dooming the protagonist or calling to them to greatness. Is it a cliche that you think the world is bored of, or do you think it can still be used effectively?
I think it is a cliche.
So when you see a prophecy in a story, do you just kind of eye roll and be like, yeah, whatever, mate, and move on?
It is quite predictable. It's always like, oh, it will come true, but not quite in the way that you think. And I'm like, if you can do it and I will forgive you for it, but you better have a really good reason, in my opinion.
I kind of disagree. I mean, I kind of agree with you, but I kind of disagree at the same time. In the sense that I think it's a trope in the same way that good versus evil is a trope that can still be used effectively. It's been used a lot, but it's a framework to set up a scenario or set of expectations within the worldview or within the character, which the story can then tackle in any way that it likes. They can tackle it in a tired way, or they can do it in a new way that challenges our preconceptions about the trope and the world, but you need to set the trope up in the first place to be able to dismantle it or to talk about it. And to me, I think the prophecy in particular is a stand-in for our sense of fate and for the weight of expectation in the world that we live in. And I think that's still something that's quite relatable, because even if we're not all like chosen ones with massive destiny, there's people want to sometimes think that they were born for something, in which case it appeals to that part of them, or there's the frustration of other people constantly trying to decide what your life is, or it feels like that they're constantly trying to decide what your life is, and a prophecy is a vehicle to kind of deal with those frustrations about free will and determinism.
So it's kind of a shorthand in fantasy to put the protagonist on a path where they defy their fate and seize their own destiny and things that are common in fantasy stories.
Yeah. Like, it's not about the prophecy so much as it is about the dealing with either being on your path or not being on your path, or dealing with the expectations people have of you, which I think is something that's still very universal.
That's a good point.
I like that you can use it to build intrigue and suspense from the start of the story. I think it can be used effectively in that way. So for example, in this story, well, now I'm interested. I want to know how she's going to kill her brothers, you know?
Yeah, and then you kind of wonder, is it going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy where their responses to the prophecy causes it to come true, or is it going to be something within the character, or like it raises a lot of questions, doesn't it?
Yeah. And questions are what keeps you going.
I do like that in this story they immediately dismiss the let's murder our child option.
Yeah, the Queen is just like, that's too mean, we have to think of something else.
Yeah.
It would have been a short story.
I mean, not really. It's almost a cliche, isn't it, where they try and kill their child and then their child comes back to haunt them. It's very gothic. Well, normally how villains end up happening.
You've persuaded me.
Well, their prophecies are great.
I wouldn't go that far. Reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the writer, as with any kind of trope.
Yeah, I think I would still roll my eyes a little if your plot is centered around it, but as kind of a setup tool makes sense.
Yeah, I think most often it is just a setup tool. If you're playing it too straight, I think it can be a problem. But, or you're not doing anything with it particularly, it's just there because, it's a fantasy story and they all have prophecies.
If it's used to good effect, then I think it's good, but if it's just a lazy way to
give the character a motivation without giving them an actual motivation,
yeah, it's not so good.
Why are they fighting the villain? Because they're prophesied to. No! If I had a prophecy about someone, that would make me fight them.
A bit like Matt's story, A Game of Scones.
Yeah.
I liked what that did with the prophecy trope.
Yeah. I was thinking of Ender's Game, where Ender does what he's told to do, and it was a bad idea.
Oh, yeah.
That's the whole book in a sentence.
Best summary of Ender's Game ever. Okay, so this story is kind of centered on this quest to find the King of Peacocks, so Rosette can marry him. Why do you think that she chose that as the mission for her brothers? Do you think it was just random, or do you think it was because she didn't really want to get married, which is what I was thinking? What do you think?
I think it was supposed to show that because she'd been locked in this tower for so long, she didn't really have any concept of what the real world is like. So when she saw a peacock, she was like, whoa, that's incredible. I want one of those, right? And it was just kind of an immediate reaction.
This is mine now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of got that sense. Like, I would have loved it for it to be her, because she didn't want to, get married again, so she's picking an impossible suitor because she doesn't want to be tied down or anything after having only just got out of a former prison. But I think that would be a much more modern reading that the story itself doesn't particularly support, I don't think. Because there's no indication that she doesn't want to marry him. Like, she's absolutely delighted when they find him. And I think if she'd been using him as a tool to avoid getting married, she wouldn't have had that reaction.
That's possibly true. But I was excited at the thought. I was like, oh, she's sending him an impossible quest.
I think that would have been a very strong way to do the story, in that it would have kind of run with the theme of freedom a lot more. But unfortunately, I don't think it was that well written in that sense. She's a woman, and therefore, clearly she's going to want to get married, and clearly the quest has to be about marriage or something.
This is one of the earliest stories we've looked at, isn't that right?
But she was around at the same time as the guy who wrote Cinderella, Charles Perrault.
So, I mean, there's perhaps a slightly bigger culture gap with this story than some of the other ones we've dealt with, is all I'm trying to say.
She lived 1651 to 1705, so...
Yeah. I think, the earliest we'd done before that, this was, still 1800s or something. It was probably Mary Shelley, early 19th century. So this is 100 years before that.
Also, although it doesn't read as very feminist to us now, at the time, her choosing who she's going to marry would have been quite different to what culture was like for women in those times.
Would have just been like an advantageous match, wouldn't it? Rather than her leading with who she wanted to marry.
Her brothers would have told her who she was going to marry. She wouldn't have told them.
Yeah.
We've touched on this in like other stories, apart from this one. I think probably in the Star Child, in particular. But again, this story focuses a lot on how beautiful Rosette is, and how much the King of Peacocks want to marry her because he sees her painting and sees that she's beautiful. He can't believe how pretty she is. He's also described as being very beautiful. Why do you think this is so intrinsic to fairy tales? Is it part of the fantasy that, I don't know, we want to read about beautiful people? What do you think? I think Simone has probably some thoughts on this.
I do have thoughts on this, but I was going to see if anyone else wanted to go first.
I would only add that don't forget that the person who tries to trick them is described as like incredibly ugly on multiple occasions. And I think, honestly, it's a shorthand a lot of the time to tell us who's good and who's bad, but also because we like pretty things.
I think both of those are true. I was particularly on the ugly good thing. Interesting fact. So I was reading this article by Laurie Baker, Sperry, and Liz Grauholtz. Apologise if I butchered their names, on the pervasiveness and persistence of the feminine beauty ideal in children's fairy tales. And one of the statistics that came out of their study was that 31% of all fairy tale stories associate beauty with goodness, and 17% associate ugliness with evil, personified in the semblance of witches, wicked stepmothers, and conniving queens. So I think there is definitely something to the shorthand of beautiful means good and ugly means evil. But I think a larger part of that is that fairy tales, less so nowadays, but certainly originally, were stories designed to give moral messages and ultimately to maintain the status quo. And part of the status quo is the feminine beauty ideal, which is the idea of women are there to be beautiful objects, and beauty is the most important asset that a woman can have. So, having those themes included in fairy tales both reinforces that idea to the people who are reading them and makes it more likely that they'll continue following that pattern and trend in their own behaviour and policing other women and themselves to conform to the expected standard of beauty in a patriarchal society. I think is part of it. And that's not to say fairy tales are deliberately trying to teach us that we have to be beautiful. I think a lot of fairy tales just reflect dominant ideology to a certain extent, and that would have been part of it. It still is to a certain point. And I think it's also worth noting that the beauty ideal perpetuated is always a very white one. So, they're always described as fair or skin as white as snow. It's a very racialized version of beauty that's very white and patriarchal.
I always wondered if it was more like, or another way to look at it would be like, oh, you've got to behave well, or you'll be like, you don't want to be ugly, do you? You want to be beautiful and good, not evil, because if you're evil, that will make you ugly. I always wondered if there was some kind of thing that was also the other way around, so saying you'll become beautiful if you behave well or are a good person, like the protagonist. What do you think about that?
There's definitely the link between, I think, your internal behaviour reflecting your external behaviour. Fun fact, the character of Hannibal Lecter originally was written to have red eyes and 6 fingers to kind of prove that he was evil, so it's not something that's exactly gone out of fashion either, as much as we do see a lot more beautiful evil nowadays, kind of swinging the opposite way, I guess, because we're shallow and vain and like watching beautiful people. That, and I think we're probably nowadays looking more to challenge the idea of what beauty actually is.
I like the thought that I could have seen the portrait of Rosette and gone, she's not that pretty.
Peacock, who would have killed you? How dare you besmirch my wife?
Okay, so I guess we'll move on to then, is the King of Peacocks a villain? Because although he's not like, trying to drown Rosette, he is like, yeah, if your sister doesn't look like this picture, I'm gonna kill you. And he almost does. So I'm just there like, wow, I don't think Rosette should marry this guy. He's so violent.
Oh, come on. He's not that bad.
I mean, he's a bit extreme. He didn't need to threaten execution. He could have just said, let me see if she's as pretty as she is in the picture, and then I'll decide if I want to marry her.
But, he's got his hopes up now. You've shown him this beautiful picture. If she's not as pretty, he's going to be so upset. I think you should die for that, honestly.
It does fit the fact he's the king of peacocks, isn't it? Like, peacocking is kind of, vain as a peacock as a metaphor goes, like, kind of arrogant and...
Yeah, and he does say at one point, I was thinking about just letting them go and taking their ugly sister with them, but then one of the guys is like, or one of his advisors is like, oh no, you can't do that, you'll look weak in front of all your people.
Yeah.
And so he's like, oh well, I guess I'll execute him then.
I mean, I was just being facetious. I think that line in particular shifts him from not being a villain. He is at most just kind of a slightly malevolent bystander.
Yeah, the villain is clearly the nurse who tries to, take advantage of the situation. Although, I guess the King of Peacocks did lock them up beforehand. But on the other hand, he did treat them quite well as prisoners.
Yeah.
That is true, yeah.
So, I don't know, I don't think he's a villain, but I don't think he's a hero either.
Right. And I'm glad that it has this kind of character that's somewhere in the middle, because it's something that's missing in a lot of fairy tales, and I quite enjoy it.
I liked him too, I don't know, he was interesting, and I didn't know I didn't know which way he was going to go, I suppose.
Right. That's what's so good about it.
I wouldn't marry someone if I just seen their picture, though. At least want to take them for a drink. I guess it's not how the peacocks do things.
Maybe she was just that pretty that you're like, I don't even care if she's a horrible person.
Or maybe because it's fairytale land, because she's beautiful, she must also be good.
Yeah, maybe they will know that. But also, I think there's something to be said about status symbols and beauty. Like, the woman's place is to be beautiful. Of course, you want the most beautiful wife. Particularly if you're a peacock, and peacocks are all about, attracting for beauty, aren't they? The males have the massive tail feathers to, attract a mate, hence peacocking, as they term. So I suppose his aggressive, I'm gonna lock your brothers into a dungeon thing could be a weird version of peacocking in Peacockland.
I'm gonna show her man here by locking your brothers in a dungeon.
This is how serious I am about marrying you.
Quite like that.
I remembered another point I wanted to make about the beauty thing, just to backtrack quickly. You know the study I mentioned about the pervasiveness and persistence of feminine beauty? The study, one of the conclusions that it came to was that although feminine beauty is a dominant theme in many fairy tales, the fairy tales that exist and have survived and been the most reproduced are the ones that place a heavy emphasis on fairy tale beauty. So there are a lot of fairy tales that don't, but the most popular ones are the ones that do, which I think is interesting. Like, they're the ones we've chosen to continue talking about, more so than the others, like Cinderella and Snow White.
Maybe we just like beautiful princesses.
I mean, I think a lot of our world is based around attractiveness and who is attractive and who isn't, and the power that's involved in who is attractive and who isn't. So it kind of makes sense that we're slightly obsessed with it as a society.
I like that this story actually gives a description to the prince rather than just saying he's handsome, or king, sorry. A lot of the others don't really go into it much.
Yeah, I guess it's so you can imagine your own version of the handsome prince, or whatever it is that you find handsome.
I think it gives the king a bit more character, which I appreciate. So the three people who conspired to kill Rosette by towing her out the boat, so her nurse, the nurse's daughter, and the boatman. At the end of the story, everyone is so happy that they just get forgiven. What is with that?
Weak writing.
Strange, to say the least. Yeah, I think I'd agree. It's not very satisfying.
Oh, come on. I mean, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
Let me have, murderous revenge in my stories so I don't have to pursue it in real life.
All those kids are going to read this story, and then when little Timmy pushes them over in the playground, they're going to say, aha, you've wronged me, now you must be hanged.
I mean, I think also that you don't have to forgive people who've hurt you is also an important lesson to teach children. Not necessarily that you should all be hanged and horribly punished, but certainly, oh, I'm so happy I forgive you trying to kill me. It's a bit of a slope from, oh no, Timmy punched me on the playground or whatever.
I think it would seem less weird if they hadn't brought up the hanging, that he was going to hang the two brothers.
Yeah.
So
yes,
the fact that these guys are fine is just did you have a personality transplant?
Maybe it's just to show that the princess is so good and nice that she's affected him already, and he's become a better person just in her presence.
Ugh.
Simone hates everything I'm saying.
I just think they wanted a happy ending and wanted to wrap it up quickly.
I do get the sense, reading this story, that the author was very much making it up as they went along and having a fabulous time. I think that's why I like it. A lot of her stories were based on kind of oral tradition, and I wondered if that also lent to some of the strange things about its structure.
It feels like a told story rather than a shown story, I guess.
Yeah, like the other thing I was thinking was earlier in the story when they talk about the journey that they go on to find the king, and they end up in like the kingdom of mayflies or something. It just seems like a random diversion that doesn't really lead anywhere. It's really different to modern storytelling, where it feels like everything's very tightly written and everything always leads to something else later on.
It's very true.
Why is the dog green?
God, I was hoping we'd get onto this. What is up with this dog?
He's an animal companion. He's like bloody Mushu and Mulan or something, isn't he?
But why is he green?
Why is he green?
I don't know. Maybe he's a fairy dog.
I think, honestly, he's green to distract us from all the other incredible things that he does, like collecting food in a basket.
And sneaking into the palace.
Yeah. If it was just a normal dog, we'd be like, there's no way a dog could do that. But because he's green, we think, well, maybe he could. I don't know.
I didn't really think much of him to begin with, and then at the end of the story, he ends up leading the king to Rosette, which leads to the resolution, and I was just a bit like, how gloriously random.
It's a very strange addition. Also, if you're going to keep your daughter in a tower where she can't leave, why does she have a dog? The dogs need to go on walks.
I mean, so do humans, but and it could be one of those very yappy little dogs that doesn't need to walk as much.
I was thinking of Toto from The Wizard of Oz, but green.
Yeah.
He's an animal companion. Do either of you have any favourite animal companions from other stories?
I'm going to give you an unreasonably serious answer, which is that I like Oi from the Dark Tower series because he is a mystery, and I feel like the best animal companions are told when they are mysteries and we don't really know what they're about or what they can do or what they are, and we can slowly reveal it over time. It's like having a character, but usually they can't speak, right? So you can't just ask them, where did you come from, what do? You have to kind of slowly find out.
Can I give a very non-serious / also completely serious answer, which is Pikachu?
Yes!
I was obsessed as a kid. Love Pikachu.
What's your favourite thing about Pikachu?
He's yellow.
They have an enemies to friends relationship. It was rooted young.
Oh yeah, at first Pikachu doesn't want anything to do with Ash, he just shocks him over and over.
And yet they become like the closest of friends, and it's so heartwarming.
I do love that first episode where Ash is getting beat up by Pidgey to save Pikachu. It's really cute.
Yeah, like it's the idea of friendship that's not necessarily there to gain something, like you'd protect them regardless of what they're doing for you.
And I mean, Pikachu's insanely popular. If you think of Pokemon, it's just, Pikachu.
Yeah, had so many Pikachus as a kid.
Same.
I had one that could talk. You squeezed his paw and he would say, guess what he would say?
I was so hoping you'd do the voice.
Pika, Pika!
Yeah.
Yep, that's it. Pikachu!
My favourite animal companion, although now I'm like, maybe it is actually Pikachu. I was going to say Gigi from Kiki's Delivery Service. I love that sarcastic cat.
Gigi is
It's a good cat.
He has the purpose in the narrative that only Kiki can understand him, but the idea was that when she kind of grew up, she couldn't understand him anymore, and that was kind of bittersweet, and I liked that idea.
There is something about it, isn't it, with like the whole talking to animals. It's something that children do a lot.
I also feel like the animal companion is put in a lot to appeal to children. Like, you can't tell me, like, the stupid dogs in Cruella that was dressed in a rat costume wasn't there because they thought children might be watching the film.
Sometimes you don't fit in with the people around you, and an animal companion's both someone who's your friend, but also not part of the standard status quo. They're not another human who you have to engage with in the same way as you would another human. With the whole adolescence thing, a animal companion is outside of the realms of social interaction that you'd be expected to do.
Yeah, they're just kind of a loyal friend to you. For people who worry about animal companions getting killed off horribly in horror movies and the like, there is a website called doesthedogdie.com.
I've used
which
it.
will let you know. Yeah, it's great.
I've used it for every John Wick film.
It's really important to know.
Yeah, they also have a lot of other triggers listed, which can be useful.
I don't mind if you want to kill the dog, but I would like a warning sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? We can be fine with humans dying, but the second that animal's dead.
It's just a helpless animal. It doesn't know what's going on. Alright, so I will give you some facts then about the author. Madame Dornoy. She was a very interesting lady.
I actually know nothing about her. I've never heard of her.
Yeah, I came across her and I'd never heard of her either. And then I read this tidbit that she coined the term fairy tale. In French, I think you say it conte de fées. And she used it because in a lot of her stories, fairy interferes somehow. So in Princess Rosette, they're the ones that give the prophecy that Rosette is going to kill her brothers. So yeah, I was interested in the fact that she coined this really famous term, and I'd never even heard of her. And she wrote more stories than Charles Perrault, which people have heard of. She wrote 25 fairy tales. She was married at 13 to a gambler 30 years older than her. This did not go well for her, or anybody, in fact. She tried to have him killed, so she tried to frame him for treason. She teamed up with her mother to do this. It didn't work. He was proved innocent, and she was sent off to prison for a bit for trying to frame him, but they couldn't prove anything, so she got out. Yeah.
That's quite the story.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I thought this was just going to be another, maybe she drank a lot of alcohol kind of person, as a lot of authors do, but no. Straight up, she tried to frame her husband and get him killed.
Maybe that's why she's so quick to have the forgive the people at the end.
Maybe. It's also speculated that later on she tried to help one of her friends have their husband assassinated, but there's only rumours, nothing was ever confirmed. She had a very mysterious life. Like, after she left prison, she went travelling for about 13 years, and she said that she went, I think, to Spain and the UK, and she wrote like a diary, but a lot of people were like, this is clearly made up. Some of it was highly exaggerated. It was rumoured that she was a spy for the French. There are a lot of weird stories about her and her life, which honestly I'd love to do a deeper look at her because she sounds like a fascinating person. Anyway, so she did that for a bit. Then she ended up back in France. She came back to Paris. She kind of established herself. She ran a literary salon and networked with a lot of aristocratic women who they ended up calling themselves fairies, and they used to rebel against the king, probably not in very effective ways because I couldn't really find much about it. But I like that she just didn't care.
Modern writer societies are clearly so tame now.
They definitely are. Yeah, that's her life in a nutshell. I probably have not done it justice because it sounds seriously crazy. And she wrote fairy tales because I think she heard them from her mother and her grandmother. She had more modern, at the time, feminist takes on things, such as women deciding who they were going to marry and what they were going to do. And she even had like a version of Beauty and the Beast, which I think was called The Ram. She had one where there's a cross-dressing countess as well, which sounds very interesting, and I'm going to have to go read it because it sounds great.
Do you think it's because she's from further ago? Do you think just the older these people are, the crazier their lives get?
Maybe. But it could also be that because she's from so long ago, it's difficult to know what's true.
Yeah, fair.
It is, but I think to a certain extent nowadays the world almost feels smaller and you're certainly more observed. Like, if you went and did something crazy nowadays, your employer would pretty much immediately find out about it and you'd probably lose your job and livelihood. Whereas before, providing you were of sufficient means, you could pretty much, just so long as you didn't, commit violent crime. And even then, you could probably get away with committing violent crime because forensics weren't that great. Like, do anything you liked, really. And there was a much more of a sense of cult of personality, wasn't there?
She certainly sounds like a personality. Alright, well, I think we'll wrap up then. Thank you for listening. You can find all our previous short stories and episodes on our website at theshortstoryworkshop.com. If you'd like to contact us, you can do so on Twitter. I am at Ficaholic, Matt
at MattBWriter,
and Simone
T_M_typewriter, also known as the modern typewriter.
Alright, thank you for listening. We'll be back with another story next week. Goodbye.